Eleanor Wright's hands trembled as she stepped off the stagecoach into the Wyoming dust, her ribs screaming beneath the corset she'd laced too tight to hide the bruises. The man waiting at the station, her husband by contract, a stranger by every other measure, watched her with eyes that seemed to see straight through the carefully constructed lies she'd rehearsed for 3,000 miles. She had fled Boston's violence for this frontier promise of safety. But as Caleb Turner's gaze lingered on the way she favored her left side, Eleanor realized with cold certainty that some secrets refused to stay buried. Thank you for joining Eleanor's journey toward healing and hope. If this story touches your heart, please like this video and comment with your city below. I love seeing how far these frontier tales travel across the world. Now let's begin where fear and courage meet on a dusty Wyoming road. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the town of Clearwater, Wyoming territory, turning the main street into a ribbon of dust and heat shimmer. Eleanor Wright pressed herself into the corner of the stagecoach's wooden bench, watching the landscape transform from rolling grassland into the scattered buildings of civilization, if one could call it that. The jolting ride had aggravated every injury she carried, each bump sending fresh waves of pain through her carefully hidden wounds. She was 26 years old and felt ancient. Through the coach window, she caught glimpses of the town taking shape. A general store with weathered siding, a saloon with bat-wing doors swinging in the hot breeze, a church with a crooked steeple that seemed to reach toward heaven with uncertainty. Women in simple calico dresses moved along the wooden sidewalks, their faces weathered by sun and wind in a way that Boston ladies would have considered tragic. Eleanor envied them their honest weariness. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man who'd said perhaps 20 words during the entire 2-day journey from Cheyenne, called out to his horses. The team slowed, their hooves clopping against packed earth as they approached the station. Eleanor's chest tightened. This was it. The moment she'd traveled 3,000 miles to reach, the moment that would determine whether she'd found salvation or simply exchanged one prison for another. Her fingers found the letter in her pocket, its edges soft from constant handling over the past 6 weeks. She'd memorized every word Caleb Turner had written in his careful, measured script, but she pulled it out anyway, needing the reassurance of something tangible. Dear Miss Wright, your letter reached me in good time. I am a rancher of modest means, 32 years of age, with a homestead 10 miles north of Clearwater. I live alone and work the land with 2 hired hands. I am looking for a wife who values honesty and hard work over society's finer trappings. If you are such a woman, I would be honored to meet you and discuss a potential arrangement. The territory is beautiful but unforgiving. The work is hard. The winters are harder. But there is freedom here for those willing to claim it. If you decide to come, wire ahead with your arrival date. I will meet you at the Clearwater station. Respectfully, Caleb Turner. The letter promised nothing except honesty and work. Eleanor had found it refreshing after weeks of reading flowery advertisements from men seeking delicate flowers and gentle ornaments for their frontier homes. Caleb Turner's directness had felt like solid ground after months of quicksand. She had not told him the truth, of course. Her own letter had been full of careful omissions and strategic vagueness. Yes, she could cook and sew. Yes, she understood ranch life would be demanding. Yes, she was prepared for the isolation and hardship of frontier living. No, she hadn't mentioned why a well-educated Boston woman with family connections would flee to Wyoming territory with nothing but a single trunk and desperate hope. She hadn't explained the real reason she wore high collars in summer. She certainly hadn't confessed that her last clear memory before boarding the train was of her brother-in-law's fist connecting with her cheekbone, or the sound of her sister's voice calling her dramatic as she'd stumbled toward the door with blood in her mouth. The coach lurched to a stop. Eleanor's hand flew to her side, pressing against the bandages wrapped around her ribs beneath her dress. She'd rewrapped them that morning at the way station, her fingers shaking as she'd examined the bruising in the cracked mirror of the washroom. The discoloration had faded from purple-black to a sickly yellow-green, but the pain remained sharp and present. Clearwater Station, the driver announced, his voice carrying the same enthusiasm one might use to announce the location of a graveyard. Through the window, Eleanor saw him, a tall man in work clothes standing beside a wagon, his hat pulled low against the sun. Caleb Turner. Her future. Her escape. Her last chance. She took a breath that made her ribs protest, gathered her worn carpet bag, and stepped toward the coach door. The heat hit her first, dry and relentless, nothing like Boston's humid summers. Then the dust, rising in small clouds with each movement. The driver had already climbed down and was hauling her trunk from the storage compartment with practiced efficiency. Eleanor accepted his hand to descend the coach steps, moving carefully to avoid jarring her injuries. And then Caleb Turner was there, removing his hat, and Eleanor got her first real look at the man she'd agreed to marry. He was older than she'd expected from his letter, not in years perhaps, but in bearing. His face was weathered the way old leather gets weathered, creased at the eyes and mouth from squinting into sun and wind. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the calloused hands of someone who'd spent his life working with them. His hair was dark brown with threads of premature silver at the temples, and his eyes were gray, like storm clouds, and they saw too much. Eleanor felt those eyes track over her face, down to where her traveling dress concealed the worst of her injuries, then back up to meet her gaze. She lifted her chin, refusing to flinch, but she could feel her heart hammering against her damaged ribs. Miss Wright. His voice was low and even, with a slight roughness that suggested long silences broken only when necessary. I'm Caleb Turner. Mr. Turner? Eleanor extended her hand, proud that it didn't shake. Thank you for meeting me. He took her hand carefully, his grip gentle despite the obvious strength in his fingers. His palm was warm and rough, and he released her hand almost immediately, as if worried he might somehow hurt her. Your journey was long, he said, not quite a question. Yes. You must be tired. I've been more comfortable, Eleanor admitted. Something flickered in his expression, concern, perhaps, or recognition. The wagon's just here. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. There's a canvas cover, so you'll be out of the direct sun. He moved toward her trunk, lifting it with ease that made Eleanor wince in sympathy with her own weakness. She'd barely been able to drag it across the train platform in Cheyenne. Caleb secured it in the wagon bed with efficient movements, then turned back to her. Can I help you up? Eleanor hesitated. The wagon seat was higher than the coach had been, and she wasn't sure she could manage it without revealing her discomfort. But refusing help would be suspicious. Thank you. Caleb stepped close, offering his hand again. Eleanor placed her palm in his and felt his other hand settle lightly at her waist to steady her. The contact was brief and professional, but she felt him pause, just for a heartbeat, when his fingers encountered the rigid lines of the bandaging beneath her dress. He said nothing, simply helped her onto the wagon seat with careful strength, then stepped back and retrieved her carpet bag, placing it at her feet. When he climbed up beside her, he left a respectful distance between them on the bench. Ready? He asked. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Caleb clicked to the horses and the wagon lurched into motion. They rode in silence through town, past curious faces and openly staring eyes. Eleanor kept her gaze forward, aware that every person they passed was cataloging her appearance, making judgments, forming opinions that would follow her through whatever life she managed to build here. The stranger, the mail-order bride, the desperate woman from back east who'd traveled across a continent to marry a man she'd never met. Let them stare. She'd endured worse scrutiny. The town fell away quickly, replaced by open prairie that stretched toward distant mountains. The sun climbed higher, turning the landscape into shades of gold and brown and endless blue. Despite everything, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of all that empty space. No crowds. No narrow streets where violence could trap you against brick walls. No drawing rooms full of people who looked the other way while their relatives committed atrocities behind closed doors. It's beautiful, she said softly. Caleb glanced at her, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Most women from back east find it desolate. I find it spacious. He considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. I suppose that's a fair assessment. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt slightly less strained now. The wagon creaked and swayed over the rough trail, and Eleanor focused on keeping her breathing steady despite the jostling that aggravated her ribs. She could feel Caleb's awareness beside her, the way his attention seemed to track her small movements, even while his eyes stayed on the trail ahead. Finally, he spoke again. "There are some things we should discuss before we reach the ranch." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "Of course." "I want you to understand what you're agreeing to." He kept his voice level, matter of fact. "The ranch house is simple. 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft above. There's a well for water, but everything has to be carried and heated. The nearest neighbor is 4 miles east, town is 10 miles south, and the roads get difficult in winter." "I understand." "I have 2 men who work the property, James and Thomas. They're good men, respectful. They bunk in the barn and take their meals at the ranch house. You'd be expected to cook for all of us." "I can cook." Caleb nodded, but his jaw had tightened slightly. "The work is constant. Sunrise to sunset most days, more during calving season or when we're working the herds. There's not much time for leisure, especially not for social visits or town gatherings." "Mr. Turner," Eleanor turned to face him directly, ignoring the protest in her ribs. "I didn't come here expecting leisure or society. I came because your letter was honest. You offered work and hardship and freedom. That's more than most men offer." He met her gaze then, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Eleanor saw him taking in the details she couldn't hide, the shadows under her eyes from weeks of poor sleep, the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself slightly curved to protect her damaged side. "Why did you really come here, Miss Wright?" The question was gentle but direct. Eleanor felt her carefully constructed walls strain against the urge to tell him everything, the violence, the fear, the desperation that had driven her across a continent. But they'd only just met. He was still a stranger, regardless of the contract they'd agreed to through letters. "I came for the same reason most women come to the frontier," she said carefully. "For a new beginning." "What are you beginning over from?" Eleanor looked away, across the endless prairie. "Does it matter?" "It might." "Why?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "Because I need to know if someone is going to come looking for you. And if they do, whether I should invite them to stay or invite them to leave." The implication settled over Eleanor like a blanket. Not smothering, but protective. He wasn't asking her to confess. He was asking whether she needed defending. "No one is coming," she said quietly. "No one who matters, anyway." "You're certain?" "Yes." He nodded once, accepting her answer. "Then we don't need to speak of it again unless you want to." Gratitude flooded through Eleanor so suddenly it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, refusing to cry in front of this man she barely knew. "Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for." Caleb's attention returned to the trail ahead. "We all carry things we'd rather leave behind." They rode on in silence, but the quality of it had changed. The tension that had pulled tight between them since the station had eased into something approaching companionship, or at least mutual understanding. The sun climbed higher, and Eleanor felt sweat trickling down her spine beneath her traveling dress. The bandages around her ribs grew damp and uncomfortable, chafing against healing injuries. She shifted carefully on the wagon seat, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate the pain. Beside her, Caleb reached beneath the seat and produced a canteen. "Water?" "Please." He handed it to her, and Eleanor drank gratefully, the water warm but wet. When she tried to return it, Caleb shook his head. "Keep it. There's more at the ranch." "Thank you." He nodded, then clicked to the horses, urging them into a slightly faster pace. "We're almost there." Eleanor looked up and saw it. A homestead nestled in a slight valley, where a creek cut through the grassland and cottonwood trees offered precious shade. The ranch house was exactly as Caleb had described, simple, sturdy, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray. A barn stood nearby, larger than the house, with a corral attached where several horses watched their approach with lazy interest. Behind everything, the mountains rose like sentinels, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. It was nothing like Boston, nothing like the elegant townhouse where Eleanor had lived with her sister and brother-in-law, with its polished floors and papered walls and suffocating expectations. It was perfect. "Home," Caleb said simply. The words settled into Eleanor's chest like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. As they descended toward the ranch, 2 men emerged from the barn. The hired hands Caleb had mentioned. They were younger than Eleanor expected, perhaps in their early 20s, both lean and weathered from outdoor work. They stood watching the wagon approach with expressions of open curiosity. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down, moving around to Eleanor's side. This time when he offered his hand, she took it without hesitation, letting him help her to the ground. Her legs had stiffened during the ride, and she stumbled slightly on landing. Caleb steadied her with a hand at her elbow, his grip firm but careful. "Easy," he said quietly. The two young men approached, removing their hats in respectful greeting. Up close, Eleanor could see they were brothers. Same brown eyes, same sun-bleached hair, same spattering of freckles across their noses. "Miss Wright," Caleb said formally, "these are my hired men, James and Thomas Garrett. They've worked this ranch for 3 years." "Ma'am," the taller one, James, Eleanor guessed, nodded politely. "Welcome to Turner Ranch and—" "Thank you." Eleanor managed a smile despite her exhaustion. "I'm pleased to meet you both." Thomas, the younger brother, grinned. "We've been mighty curious about you, ma'am. Boss here's been tight-lipped as a clam about his bride-to-be." "That's enough," Caleb said, but there was no real heat in the rebuke. "Take Miss Wright's trunk to the house. Carefully." "Yes, sir." The brothers moved to obey, hoisting the trunk between them and carrying it toward the ranch house with exaggerated care that made Eleanor smile despite herself. Caleb turned to her, his expression uncertain for the first time since they'd met. "I should show you the house. There's not much to it, but it's clean and weatherproof." "I'm sure it will be fine." He led her across the hard-packed earth toward the front door, and Eleanor took in details as they walked. Chickens pecking in a small coop beside the house, a vegetable garden that needed weeding, laundry lines strung between posts, a water pump near the back door. Signs of life and work and careful maintenance. The house was dim inside after the bright sunlight, and Eleanor paused in the doorway to let her eyes adjust. When they did, she found herself in a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space combined. A large table dominated the center with mismatched chairs gathered around it. The kitchen area held a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with supplies and cookware, and a dry sink beneath a window that looked out toward the creek. A stone fireplace occupied one wall, and a few simple furnishings, a rocking chair, a bench, a chest of drawers, completed the space. It was sparse but not barren, functional but not cold. Someone had made an effort to keep it organized and clean, though Eleanor could see places where a woman's touch had been absent for too long. "The bedroom is through there," Caleb gestured toward a door on the far wall. "And there's a sleeping loft above, accessible by that ladder. James and Thomas use it when the weather's too rough for the barn, but otherwise they stay out there." Eleanor nodded, processing this information. "And where will you sleep?" The question hung in the air between them. Caleb's expression remained carefully neutral. "That depends on you, Miss Wright." "Eleanor," she said quietly. "If we're to be married, you should call me Eleanor." "Eleanor, then." He cleared his throat. "I want you to understand that nothing will happen between us that you don't want. We can marry tomorrow in town. There's a circuit judge who passes through every few weeks, and he's due day after tomorrow. But the marriage itself doesn't obligate you to anything beyond the work we discussed." Eleanor studied him, trying to reconcile this gentle giant with every man she'd known in Boston. "You're saying you'd marry me and expect nothing in return?" "I'm saying I'd marry you and expect honesty, partnership, and good faith. The rest—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The rest can happen in its own time, if it happens at all." Something cracked open inside Eleanor's chest, some frozen place she'd kept locked and protected for so long she'd forgotten it could thaw. "Why?" she whispered. Caleb met her gaze steadily. "Because I've seen what forced affection looks like, and I want no part of it. You came here for safety. I aim to provide it, no strings attached." Eleanor felt tears threatening again and blinked them back furiously. "I don't understand you. You don't have to. Not yet." He moved toward the door, giving her space. "I'll have the boys bring in your trunk. Take your time settling in. There's water in the pitcher by the wash basin, and there's a privacy screen in the bedroom for dressing. When you're ready, come out, and we'll have supper." He left before Eleanor could respond, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click. Alone for the first time in days, Eleanor sank into the rocking chair and pressed her hands to her face. Her ribs ached. Her body ached. Her heart ached with the weight of hope she'd thought she'd lost forever. Outside, she could hear the Garrett brothers talking in low voices as they brought her trunk to the porch. Caleb's voice joined them, too distant to make out words, but the tone was warm and familiar. These were men who worked together daily, who trusted each other, who'd built something functional and good out here in the middle of nowhere. Eleanor stood, wincing at the pull in her side, and moved to explore the bedroom Caleb had indicated. It was small but adequate, with a bed covered in a simple quilt, a dresser, and a washstand with the promised pitcher and basin. A single window looked out toward the mountains, curtainless but clean. The trunk appeared in the doorway, carried by Thomas. "Where would you like this, ma'am?" "At the foot of the bed, please." He set it down carefully, then back toward the door. "Boss says to take your time. Supper's not for another hour or so." "Thank you, Thomas." When he'd gone, Eleanor locked the door and began the painful process of undressing. The traveling dress first, its buttons stubborn under her shaking fingers. Then the corset, unlaced with relief that made her gasp. Finally, the bandages around her ribs, unwound slowly to reveal the landscape of her injuries. The bruising had faded considerably, but she could still trace the outline of where Richard's boot had connected with her side 3 weeks ago. Could still remember the sound of her sister screaming at her to stop being so dramatic, to apologize, to do whatever it took to keep peace in the household. Eleanor had left that night, taken what money she'd saved from her modest inheritance, packed one trunk, and fled to the train station in darkness. She'd sent one letter back, to her sister, explaining that she was safe and asking not to be followed. She hadn't waited for a response. And now here she was, 3,000 miles and a lifetime away, standing half-dressed in a Wyoming ranch house belonging to a man who'd promised safety without obligation. Eleanor pressed her fingers gently to her ribs, testing the damage. The pain was manageable now, nothing like those first terrible days. The bruising would fade completely in another week or two. The fear would take longer, but maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where healing was possible. She rewrapped her ribs with clean bandages from her trunk, then dressed in a simple day dress, nothing fancy but clean and presentable. She brushed her hair and pinned it up in a simple style, then studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her was thinner than she'd been a month ago, with shadows under her eyes and a wariness in her expression that hadn't been there before Richard's violence had escalated from words to fists. But she was standing upright. She was breathing. She was here. That would have to be enough for now. Eleanor unlocked the door and stepped back into the main room. Through the window, she could see Caleb near the barn, talking with James while Thomas worked with one of the horses in the corral. The scene was so ordinary, so peacefully mundane, that Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She moved to the kitchen area, examining the supplies and cookware with a practiced eye. If she was going to earn her place here, she might as well start by doing what she did best. The pantry held staples: flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, coffee. The cold box contained fresh meat wrapped in cloth, eggs, and a crock of butter. Not much variety, but enough to work with. Eleanor had cooked for her sister's household for 5 years after their parents died, managing a kitchen with far more resources but no more genuine appreciation. At least here, the men would be eating out of hunger rather than social obligation. She found an apron hanging on a hook and tied it around her waist, then set to work. An hour later, when Caleb came through the door with the Garrett brothers in tow, the house smelled of fresh biscuits and pan-fried steak. Eleanor had found vegetables in the garden, potatoes, onions, early carrots, and had roasted them with the meat. Coffee bubbled on the stove, strong and black. All 3 men stopped in the doorway, surprise written plainly on their faces. "I hope you don't mind," Eleanor said, suddenly uncertain. "I thought I might be useful." Caleb removed his hat slowly, his gray eyes moving from the set table to the steaming food to Eleanor's face. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to. You've had a long day, and She hesitated. "I needed something to do with my hands." Something shifted in his expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. "It smells wonderful. Thank you." They ate with the efficiency of men accustomed to ranch work and early mornings. Conversation was sparse, but comfortable, consisting mostly of James and Thomas sharing news about the day's work, a fence that needed mending, a cow showing signs of illness, plans for moving the herd to higher pasture before the summer heat intensified. Eleanor watched and listened, learning the rhythm of this place through small details. The way Caleb listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, the brothers paid attention. The easy familiarity between them, built on years of shared labor, the absence of posturing or performance. No one was trying to impress her or prove anything. They were simply eating supper after a day's work. It was so different from the tense, formal meals she'd endured in Boston that Eleanor felt herself relaxing by increments. "This is the best meal we've had in months," Thomas announced, reaching for his third biscuit. "Ma'am, if you cook like this regular, we might never let you leave." "Thomas," Caleb said warningly, "I'm just saying—" "You're just saying too much." But there was affection in Caleb's tone. He turned to Eleanor. "What he means is that we're grateful. The cooking here has been functional." James snorted. "That's charitable, boss. It's been barely edible." "I don't complain about your cooking," Caleb pointed out. "That's because you have the taste buds of a fence post." Eleanor found herself smiling at their banter, the easy way they needled each other without genuine meanness. This was family, she realized. Not by blood, but by choice and circumstance and years of depending on each other. After supper, the Garrett brothers excused themselves to the barn, thanking Eleanor profusely for the meal. When they'd gone, Caleb helped her clear the table in comfortable silence, carrying dishes to the sink while Eleanor scraped plates and organized leftovers. "You don't have to help," she said. "I can manage." "I know you can." Caleb set down the last of the dishes. "But there's no rule that says I can't." They worked side by side, Eleanor washing while Caleb dried and put things away with the familiarity of someone who knew where everything belonged. The domesticity of it felt surreal, standing in a frontier kitchen with a man she'd met only hours ago, doing dishes like they'd done this 1,000 times before. When the last plate was dried and stacked, Caleb hung the dish towel on its hook and turned to face her. In the lamplight, his weathered features looked softer, less guarded. "There's something we should discuss," he said quietly. Eleanor's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. "What is it?" "The judge will be in town day after tomorrow, like I said. If we're going to marry, that's when it would happen." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I want you to be certain it's what you want. Not what you feel obligated to do because you came all this way, but what you actually want for yourself." Eleanor studied him in the flickering lamplight. This man who'd offered her safety without demanding anything in return, who'd seen her pain without forcing confession, who treated her with a careful respect she'd thought no longer existed in the world. "And if I say I want to wait?" she asked quietly. "If I ask for more time?" "Then we wait." His answer was immediate and certain. "You can stay here regardless. Work as hired help if you'd prefer. I'll pay you fair wages and you'd have your own space. No expectations, no pressure. Or if you decide this isn't right, I'll take you back to town and stake you enough money to get wherever you want to go." The offer was so generous, so completely without self-interest, that Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes again. "Why would you do that?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "Because nobody should have to choose safety by giving up their freedom. And because—" He paused, then continued quietly. "Because I know what it's like to feel trapped. Different circumstances, maybe, but I know that weight. I won't add to it." Eleanor's breath caught. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, laying her palm against his calloused fingers. "I ran away from Boston 3 weeks ago," she heard herself say. "From my sister's house, where I'd been living since our parents died. Her husband, he hurt me. More than once. And she blamed me for it, said I provoked him, said I should be grateful they'd taken me in at all." Caleb's hand tightened around hers, but he said nothing, waiting. "The last time, he broke my ribs. I left that night and never looked back." Eleanor forced herself to meet his eyes. "I came here because your letter was honest and offered work instead of romance. I came because I needed to disappear somewhere no one would think to look. I came because I was desperate and broken and terrified. And now," Caleb's voice was gentle, "now I'm still terrified. Eleanor admitted, "but I'm also hopeful. Because you've been kinder to me in one day than anyone's been in years. Because this place feels like it could be home if I let it. Because I think—" She swallowed hard. "I think maybe I could heal here." Caleb was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to fear she'd said too much. But when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Then heal here, however long it takes. Whatever you need." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gentle gesture that made Eleanor's heart skip. "We'll marry day after tomorrow if you're willing. Not because it's expected, but because it'll give you legal protection and a name that's yours. And after that, we'll take things one day at a time, at whatever pace you set." Eleanor felt something break open inside her, the last wall she'd built around her battered heart. "Caleb, one more thing." He met her eyes steadily. "If your brother-in-law ever comes looking for you, he'll wish he hadn't. That's a promise." The fierce protectiveness in his voice, in his eyes, made Eleanor's breath catch. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb nodded, then released her hand and stepped back, giving her space even in this moment of connection. "You should rest. It's been a long day, and tomorrow won't be any easier. I'll sleep in the loft tonight. The bedroom's yours." "Caleb, I can't take your bed." "You can and you will." His tone left no room for argument. "I've slept in worse places than the loft. You need a good night's rest more than I do." Before Eleanor could protest further, he was moving toward the ladder, gathering a blanket from the chest by the fireplace. "There's a lock on the bedroom door," he called back. "Use it if it makes you feel safer. I won't be offended." Then he was climbing the ladder to the loft, leaving Eleanor standing in the lamplight, overwhelmed by the casual way he'd offered her both security and dignity. She made her way to the bedroom in a daze, closing the door behind her. She stared at the lock for a long moment, then deliberately left it unturned. Caleb had earned that trust at least. Eleanor undressed slowly, mindful of her healing ribs, and slipped into her nightgown. The bed was simple but comfortable, the quilt soft from many washings. Through the small window, she could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston, spread across the heavens in impossible profusion. She lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of this new place. Crickets singing in the grass, horses moving in the barn, the creek running its eternal course beyond the house. And above her, in the loft, the quiet movements of a man who'd promised her safety and then proven it through restraint rather than force. For the first time in months, Eleanor slept without nightmares. Morning came with the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee already brewing. Eleanor woke disoriented, her hand instinctively reaching for the bruises on her ribs before she remembered where she was. Wyoming, the Turner Ranch, safety. She dressed quickly, rewrapping her bandages with practiced efficiency, then chose a sturdy work dress in faded blue calico. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned her hair, nerves and anticipation warring in her stomach. Today she would prove herself useful. Today she would begin earning her place in this strange new world. When she emerged from the bedroom, Caleb was already at the stove, spatula in hand, attempting to flip what appeared to be eggs. The results were mixed at best. "Good morning," Eleanor said softly. He turned, and something in his expression eased when he saw her. "Morning. I didn't want to wake you, but the boys need breakfast before they head out to the north pasture." "Let me." Eleanor crossed to the stove, gently taking the spatula from his hand. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin. "You've done enough. I can handle this." Caleb hesitated, then nodded and moved to the table, where the Garrett brothers were already seated, watching this domestic exchange with poorly concealed interest. Eleanor ignored their stares and focused on salvaging the eggs, adding fresh ones to the pan along with salt and a pinch of dried herbs she'd found in the pantry the night before. Within minutes, she'd produced a breakfast that actually resembled food: scrambled eggs with herbs, thick slices of bacon, and biscuits she'd made from the leftover dough from supper. The men ate with enthusiasm, and Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction in their appreciation. "Ma'am," James said between bites, "if you keep cooking like this, we might have to ask the boss for a raise just to afford courting women who can compete." "There's no competing with good cooking," Thomas added solemnly. "It's a lost cause." Eat your breakfast, Caleb said, but Eleanor caught the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. After the meal, the Garrett brothers headed out to their work, leaving Eleanor alone with Caleb in the morning light streaming through the windows. He stood by the door, hat in hand, clearly reluctant to leave but equally uncertain about staying. I need to ride out and check the herd, he said finally, but I could stay if you need help settling in. I'll be fine, Eleanor assured him. I thought I'd start by cleaning the house properly, then work on that garden. It needs attention. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Relief, perhaps? Or gratitude. The garden was my wife's project. She died 4 years ago. I've tried to maintain it, but I don't have her touch. The confession settled between them, heavy with grief Eleanor hadn't expected. I'm sorry, I didn't know you'd been married before. No reason you should. It wasn't in my letter. Caleb turned his hat in his hand, studying the brim. Martha caught fever one winter. She was gone in 3 days. It's part of why I understand needing to start over. Eleanor moved closer, drawn by the rawness in his voice. What was she like? Strong, practical. She could outwork most men and never complained about the hardship. He paused, then added quietly, but she never really wanted to be here. She came because I asked her to, and she made the best of it. But this life wore on her. I think the fever took her because she was already tired of fighting. The honesty in his words struck Eleanor deeply. That must have been difficult, knowing she wasn't happy. It was harder watching her pretend she was. Caleb met Eleanor's eyes then, and she saw the weight of old regrets there. That's why I meant what I said last night. I won't trap you in a life you don't want. I've lived that mistake already. Eleanor reached out and touched his arm, a brief contact that made him still. I'm not Martha, and I chose to come here. Whatever happens, that choice is mine. Caleb covered her hand with his own, just for a moment, then stepped back and settled his hat on his head. I'll be back by noon. If you need anything, James and Thomas are in the north pasture. Fire 3 shots from the rifle by the door and they'll come running. I'll be fine, Eleanor repeated. Go. Do your work. He nodded and left, and Eleanor watched through the window as he saddled his horse with efficient movements, then rode north toward the mountains. When he disappeared from view, she turned to survey her new domain. The house needed work. That much was clear in the morning light. Dust coated every surface, dishes were stacked haphazardly in the cupboards, and the floor hadn't seen a proper scrubbing in what looked like months. It was the home of men who worked too hard to care about domestic niceties, who ate to fuel their bodies and slept to recover strength for the next day's labor. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By mid-morning, she'd swept and scrubbed the floor until the wood planks showed their original honey color. She'd washed every dish and reorganized the cupboards with an efficiency born of years managing her sister's household. The windows now sparkled, letting in light that transformed the space from dim and masculine to bright and welcoming. Her ribs protested the activity, sending sharp reminders with each twist and bend, but Eleanor pushed through the pain. She'd learned long ago that keeping busy was the best defense against memory and fear. Work left no room for dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. She was beating dust from the braided rug when she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw a wagon coming down the trail from town, a woman driving, with 2 children visible in the back. Eleanor's stomach tightened with anxiety. Visitors, strangers who would judge her, assess her, form opinions that would spread through the community. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside to greet them, lifting her chin the way she'd learned to do when facing Boston society. The woman who climbed down from the wagon was perhaps 40, with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun and a face weathered by sun and hard living. She wore a simple dress and practical boots, and her eyes were sharp as she looked Eleanor over. You must be the mail-order bride, she said without preamble. I'm Sarah Mitchell. My husband owns the ranch 4 miles east. These are my children, Emma and Daniel. Eleanor forced a smile. Eleanor Wright, it's nice to meet you, Mrs. Mitchell. Is it? Sarah's expression was skeptical. We'll see about that. I brought you some preserves and bread as a welcome gift. Least I could do for another woman fool enough to choose this God-forsaken territory. The bluntness startled a genuine laugh out of Eleanor. Thank you. That's very kind. Sarah's expression softened slightly. You don't look like most of the mail-order brides we get through here. You've got education written all over you, and those hands haven't seen much rough work until recently. Eleanor felt her defenses rise. I can work hard, Mrs. Mitchell. I won't be a burden to Mr. Turner. I'm sure you can. Sarah handed Eleanor a basket heavy with jars and a loaf of bread. But that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is whether you'll last the winter. This territory eats up soft women from back east and spits out their bones. I'm not as soft as I look. No? Sarah's gaze dropped to where Eleanor's left hand pressed unconsciously against her ribs. You're hurt. Recent injury, I'd say, from the way you're favoring that side. Eleanor dropped her hand immediately. I'm fine. Lying won't help you here. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact rather than unkind. Out here, we're too isolated to afford pride. If you're hurt or sick or struggling, you tell someone. Understand? I understand. Good. Sarah glanced back at her children, who were petting the ranch dog that had appeared from the barn. Caleb Turner is a good man, one of the best I know. He's been alone too long since Martha died, and this ranch needs a woman's presence. But he won't force you to stay if you're unhappy. He's too decent for that. I know, Eleanor said quietly. He's already made that clear. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then maybe you're smarter than you look. Come by the Mitchell place when you can. It's good for women out here to stick together. God knows we're outnumbered enough as it is. She climbed back onto the wagon, called to her children, and drove away without ceremony. Eleanor stood watching until the wagon disappeared, then carried the basket inside and examined its contents. The preserves were strawberry and apricot, the bread still warm and clearly baked that morning. It was a generous gift, and Eleanor felt unexpected gratitude for this prickly neighbor who'd offered both warning and welcome in the same breath. She was putting the jars in the pantry when Caleb returned, his horse lathered from hard riding. He dismounted quickly and strode toward the house with an urgency that made Eleanor's heart skip. Did Sarah Mitchell come by? He asked as soon as he was through the door. Yes, just left a few minutes ago. She brought bread and preserves. Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly. I saw her wagon on the North Ridge and wanted to make sure you were all right. Sarah's a good woman, but she can be direct. She told me this territory eats soft women from back east and spits out their bones, Eleanor said dryly. A smile tugged at Caleb's mouth. That sounds like Sarah. He removed his hat and hung it on the peg by the door, then really looked at Eleanor for the first time since entering. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the transformed house. You've been busy. I told you I could work. I can see that. He moved through the room, taking in the clean floors, the organized cupboards, the gleaming windows. When he turned back to Eleanor, something in his expression had shifted. This is the cleanest this house has been since Martha died. Thank you. You don't have to thank me. I'm earning my keep. You're doing more than that. Caleb's voice was quiet, but certain. You're making this feel like a home again. The words settled into Eleanor's chest, warm and unexpected. Before she could respond, the door opened and the Garrett brothers tumbled in, dusty and hungry and full of news about a fence that needed immediate repair. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, cooking dinner for 4, learning the rhythm of ranch meals and work schedules, discovering where things were kept and how the household functioned. By evening, Eleanor's ribs ached fiercely from the unaccustomed labor, but she felt a deep satisfaction in her exhaustion. She'd earned it honestly. After supper, when James and Thomas had retreated to the barn, Caleb helped Eleanor with the dishes again. They worked in comfortable silence until Caleb finally spoke. Tomorrow we'll go to town. The judge arrives in the afternoon, and if you're still willing, we can be married by evening. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dishwater. And if I've changed my mind? Then we come back unmarried and nothing changes except you'll have seen the town. He dried the plate he was holding with careful attention. But I hope you haven't changed your mind. Why? Eleanor turned to face him, needing to understand. Why does it matter to you whether we marry or not? Caleb set down the plate and the dish towel, then met her eyes with that steady gray gaze that seemed to see straight through her defenses. Because I think we could be good partners. Because this ranch needs a woman's strength, and you need a safe place to heal. because in the short time you've been here, you've already made things better." He paused, then added quietly, "And because when I look at you, I don't see a burden or an obligation. I see someone brave enough to cross a continent for a fresh start. That kind of courage deserves respect." Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes. "I'm not brave, Caleb. I'm terrified most of the time." Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Eleanor Wright, whether you realize it or not." The gentle touch, the sincere words, the absolute absence of any expectation beyond what she was willing to give, it all crashed over Eleanor like a wave. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against Caleb's chest, just for a moment, needing the solid warmth of him to anchor her spinning emotions. Caleb's arms came around her carefully, holding her with the same restraint he showed in everything. No pressure, no demand, just steady presence and the promise of safety. "I haven't changed my mind," Eleanor whispered against his shirt. "I want to marry you tomorrow." She felt his breath catch, felt his arms tighten just slightly before he released her and stepped back. "Then we'll do it right. I'll take you to the general store first, and you can pick out whatever you need. Dress, supplies, anything you want. It'll be your wedding day. It should feel special." "Caleb, I know you don't need it." His voice was firm. "But you deserve it anyway. Let me do this one thing right." Eleanor nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. "All right. Thank you." The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for a wedding that felt both momentous and surreal. Eleanor dressed in her best day dress, still plain, still practical, but at least clean and well-maintained. She braided her hair and pinned it up, studying her reflection with critical eyes. She looked tired, thin, older than her years. But there was something new in her expression too, a spark of hope she hadn't seen in a very long time. Caleb was waiting by the wagon when she emerged, wearing what was clearly his Sunday best: clean trousers, a pressed shirt, a vest that had seen better days but was carefully brushed. He'd shaved and trimmed his hair, and the effect was striking. This was a man who'd made an effort, who wanted to honor the occasion even if it was born of practicality rather than romance. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You don't have to say that." "I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it." He offered his hand to help her into the wagon. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." The ride to town took nearly 2 hours over rough roads, but the morning was cool and the conversation came easier now. Caleb told her about the town, who ran which businesses, which families were welcoming, and which were best avoided, where she could find supplies and companionship when she needed it. "Sarah Mitchell runs a women's gathering once a month," he said. "They meet at different houses, work on quilts and such. Martha used to go before she got too sick. You might find it helpful." "Helpful for what?" "For not going crazy from isolation." Caleb's smile was wry. "This life can be lonely, especially for women used to society and conversation. The gatherings give you a chance to talk to people who aren't cows and hired hands." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "I'll keep that in mind." Clearwater bustled with activity when they arrived. Wagons loading supplies, children running between buildings, men gathered outside the saloon despite the early hour. Eleanor felt eyes following them as Caleb helped her down from the wagon, felt the weight of curiosity and judgment from strangers who'd heard about the mail-order bride. Let them look. She'd survived worse scrutiny in Boston drawing rooms. Caleb guided her to the general store, a sprawling building that seemed to sell everything from fabric to firearms. The proprietor, a round woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron, looked up from her ledger and smiled. "Caleb Turner, haven't seen you in town in weeks." Her gaze shifted to Eleanor with undisguised interest. "And this must be your bride-to-be?" "Mrs. Henderson, this is Eleanor Wright. Eleanor, Maggie." "Henderson runs the best store between here and Cheyenne." "Flattery will get you nowhere, but I appreciate the effort." Maggie came around the counter and took Eleanor's hands in her own flour-dusted ones. "Welcome to Clearwater, dear. I hope Caleb's been treating you well." "Very well, thank you." "Good. If he doesn't, you come tell me and I'll set him straight." Maggie's expression was fierce despite her grandmother's appearance. "Now, what can I help you find?" "Mrs. Wright needs a dress for the wedding," Caleb said. "And anything else she might want." Maggie's eyes lit up with the fervor of a woman who loved her work. "Oh, we can certainly manage that. Come with me, dear. Let's see what we have in your size." An hour later, Eleanor stood before a mirror in the store's back room, hardly recognizing herself. The dress Maggie had found was simple but lovely, pale blue cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, fitted at the waist and falling in soft folds to the floor. It was modest and practical, suitable for a frontier wedding, but it made Eleanor feel almost pretty for the first time in months. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect in it," Maggie corrected. "Now, let's see about some other necessities. You'll need a good coat for winter, and I have some beautiful fabric if you know how to sew." By the time they emerged from the back room, Caleb had acquired a stack of purchases that made Eleanor's eyes widen. Fabric, thread, a winter coat, new boots, kitchen supplies, and a beautiful quilt in shades of blue and cream that Maggie insisted was a wedding gift. "Caleb, this is too much," Eleanor protested. "It's not nearly enough," he replied calmly, paying Maggie without flinching at the total. "You came here with one trunk. You deserve more than that." Eleanor wanted to argue, but the generosity in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about obligation or expectation. It was about giving her the tools she'd need to build a life here, to feel like she belonged, rather than merely survived. "Thank you," she said quietly. They loaded the purchases into the wagon, then Caleb checked his pocket watch. "Judge won't be here for another few hours. Are you hungry?" Eleanor realized she was. "Yes, actually. There's a restaurant that serves decent food. Nothing fancy, but it's better than my cooking." The restaurant was small and crowded, filled with ranchers and townspeople taking their midday meal. Heads turned when Eleanor and Caleb entered, and Eleanor felt the weight of attention like a physical thing. She kept her chin high and her expression calm, refusing to show how much the scrutiny unsettled her. They took a table near the window, and a tired-looking waitress brought them coffee and stew without being asked. The food was simple but good, and Eleanor ate with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. "Everyone's staring," she murmured. "They're curious," Caleb said. "Give them a few weeks and they'll find someone else to gossip about." "What are they saying about me?" "Does it matter?" Eleanor considered this. In Boston, it would have mattered desperately. Reputation was everything, and gossip could destroy a person's standing in society. But here, 3,000 miles from that world, surrounded by people whose opinions held no power over her future, did it really matter what strangers thought? "No," she said slowly. "I suppose it doesn't." Caleb's smile was approving. "You're learning fast." After lunch, they walked the length of the main street, Caleb pointing out landmarks and introducing Eleanor to people they met. Most were friendly, if reserved, offering congratulations on the upcoming wedding with varying degrees of sincerity. A few were openly skeptical, their expressions suggesting they didn't expect this mail-order bride to last any longer than others who'd come and gone. Eleanor met each introduction with polite dignity, determined not to give them ammunition for their doubts. They were passing the church when a woman's voice called out, "Caleb Turner, is that you?" Caleb turned and Eleanor saw his expression shift into something wary. A woman was approaching, perhaps 30 years old, dressed in a fashionable traveling suit that looked wildly out of place on the dusty street. She was beautiful in a deliberate way, with carefully arranged blonde curls and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rebecca," Caleb said flatly. "I didn't know you were in town. Father has business with the land office. We arrived yesterday." Rebecca's gaze slid to Eleanor with unconcealed assessment. "And who is this?" "Eleanor Wright, my fiancée. We're getting married this afternoon." Rebecca's smile froze, becoming brittle. "How sudden. I hadn't heard you were courting anyone." "I wasn't. Eleanor is from Boston. We've been corresponding for several months." "A mail-order bride!" Rebecca's tone made it sound like an accusation. "How practical of you, Caleb. Though I must say I'm surprised. After Martha, I thought you'd sworn off marriage entirely." Eleanor felt Caleb tense beside her, saw his jaw tighten with suppressed anger. She stepped forward, drawing Rebecca's attention. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Price. My husband owns the largest ranch in the county." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. You're very brave coming all this way to marry a stranger, or perhaps desperate. The barb was delivered with a smile, but the cruelty behind it was unmistakable. Eleanor felt old instincts rising, the Boston debutante who'd learned to navigate society's vicious undercurrents, who knew how to cut with words as sharp as any knife. Perhaps both, Eleanor said pleasantly, though I find bravery and desperation often look similar from the outside. The difference is in the outcome, wouldn't you say? Rebecca's smile slipped. I suppose we'll see. Yes, Eleanor agreed. We will. Caleb's hand found Eleanor's elbow, warm and steadying. We should go. The judge will be arriving soon. Good day, Rebecca. He guided Eleanor away before Rebecca could respond, his stride long and purposeful. When they were out of earshot, Eleanor spoke quietly. Old friend? Old mistake. Caleb's voice was tight. Rebecca and I courted briefly before I married Martha. She expected a proposal, and when I married someone else, she married the richest man she could find out of spite. She's been a thorn in my side ever since. She still cares for you. She cares about what she couldn't have. Caleb stopped walking and turned to face Eleanor. I need you to know, whatever she says, whatever rumors she spreads, none of it matters. You're the woman I chose. You're the one I'm marrying today. The fierce certainty in his voice made Eleanor's breath catch. I believe you. Good. He offered his arm. Now, let's go get married before anything else goes wrong. The judge arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, stepping down from a mud-splattered coach, with the weary dignity of a man who'd spent too many years traveling circuit through rough territory. He was older than Eleanor expected, perhaps 60, with silver hair and spectacles that caught the afternoon light. His clerk, a nervous young man barely out of his teens, followed with an armful of leather-bound ledgers. Caleb Turner, the judge said, shaking Caleb's hand with genuine warmth. Been a while since I've seen you in town. Heard you were getting married today. News travels fast, Judge Hartwell. Always does in small towns. The judge turned to Eleanor, his expression kind behind the spectacles. And you must be the bride. I'm Judge Samuel Hartwell. I'll be officiating your ceremony, assuming you're both still willing. We are, Eleanor said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Good, good. Let's get the paperwork sorted, then we can proceed. He gestured toward the courthouse, a small building with peeling paint and windows that needed washing. I have 2 more ceremonies after yours, so we'll need to keep things moving. The courthouse interior was dim and smelled of old wood and ink. Judge Hartwell settled behind a scarred desk and pulled out a marriage certificate, dipping his pen in an inkwell with practiced efficiency. Names and ages, please. Eleanor provided her information, watching as the judge's careful script transformed her spoken words into legal reality. When he asked for her parents' names and place of birth, she felt a pang of grief for the family she'd left behind. Not her sister, who'd chosen her husband's violence over Eleanor's safety, but her parents, who'd raised her with love and died too young to see what their daughters had become. Any legal impediments to this marriage? Judge Hartwell asked, looking between them. Prior marriages, outstanding warrants, reasons this union shouldn't proceed? None, Caleb said firmly. Eleanor shook her head, grateful the judge didn't ask about family approval or blessings. Those didn't exist, and their absence would have stung in front of witnesses. Excellent. Now, we'll need 2 witnesses. Do you have anyone in mind? Caleb glanced toward the door, where James and Thomas Garrett had appeared, dressed in what were clearly their only good shirts. My ranch hands can serve. The brothers entered with the self-conscious awkwardness of young men at a formal occasion. Thomas carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, which he thrust at Eleanor with a crooked smile. We picked these for you, ma'am. Figured every bride should have flowers. Eleanor unwrapped the cloth to find a bouquet of wildflowers, prairie roses, lupine, and Indian paintbrush, their colors bright and cheerful against the dim courthouse interior. Her throat tightened with unexpected emotion. They're beautiful, thank you both. Wasn't nothing, James mumbled, his ears turning red. They grow all over the north pasture. Judge Hartwell cleared his throat. Shall we begin? They arranged themselves before the desk, Eleanor and Caleb facing the judge, the Garrett brothers flanking them like mismatched honor guards. Eleanor clutched her wildflower bouquet, its stems already wilting in the heat, and felt the surreal quality of the moment wash over her. This was her wedding day. She was marrying a man she'd known for less than 3 days, binding her life to his through legal contract and spoken vows. And somehow, impossibly, it felt right. Caleb Jacob Turner, Judge Hartwell began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ceremony. Do you take this woman, Eleanor Marie Wright, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Caleb's gray eyes found Eleanor's and held them. I do. Eleanor Marie Wright, do you take this man, Caleb Jacob Turner, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Eleanor took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders like a mantle. This was her choice, her decision, her chance at something better than what she'd left behind. I do. Then by the power vested in me by Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Judge Hartwell signed the marriage certificate with a flourish, then handed the pen to Caleb. Sign here, both of you, and your witnesses below. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she signed her name, her maiden name, for the last time. Beside her signature, Caleb added his own bold script. Then James and Thomas signed as witnesses, their signatures surprisingly neat. Judge Hartwell blotted the document, folded it carefully, and handed it to Caleb. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, you're legally married. He paused, a slight smile crossing his weathered features. Traditionally, this is when the groom kisses the bride. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. She turned to Caleb, uncertain, and saw her own nervousness reflected in his expression. They discussed the practical aspects of marriage, the living arrangements and expectations, but they hadn't talked about this. The small intimacies that marked the boundary between business arrangement and genuine union. Caleb stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away. His hand came up to cup her cheek, calloused and warm, and Eleanor found herself leaning into the touch despite her racing heart. Is this all right? He murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Caleb bent his head and brushed his lips against hers, gentle as a whisper. There and gone so quickly, Eleanor barely had time to register the sensation. But the tenderness in that brief contact made her chest ache with something she couldn't quite name. Thomas whooped enthusiastically, breaking the moment. That's how it's done, boss. Congratulations, James added, grinning, though that was the most restrained wedding kiss I've ever seen. Shut up, Caleb said, but there was no heat in it. He kept his hand on Eleanor's cheek for another heartbeat, his eyes searching hers. You all right? Yes, Eleanor whispered. I'm all right. They emerged from the courthouse into late afternoon sunshine, officially married, legally bound. Eleanor felt dazed by how quickly it had happened, less than an hour from arrival to ceremony to signed certificate. In Boston, weddings took months of planning, involved hundreds of guests, required elaborate preparations and social maneuvering. This had been simple, practical, and somehow more meaningful for its lack of spectacle. We should celebrate, Thomas declared. Can't get married without a proper celebration. There's a restaurant, James began. We're going home, Caleb interrupted firmly. Mrs. Turner has had a long day and we still have evening chores. Mrs. Turner. The name settled over Eleanor like an unfamiliar garment, not quite comfortable yet, but not entirely wrong either. She was someone new now, defined by different parameters, freed from the weight of her old identity. They loaded the wagon with supplies and wedding gifts. Maggie Henderson had added a cast-iron skillet and a set of good knives for the bride. And several townspeople had pressed small offerings into Eleanor's hands with varying degrees of warmth. A jar of honey, a packet of seeds, a hand-embroidered dish towel. Small gestures, but they added up to something that felt almost like welcome. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The Garrett brothers rode ahead on horseback, giving the newlyweds privacy in the wagon. Eleanor sat close enough to Caleb that their shoulders brushed with each sway of the wagon, a small intimacy that felt both strange and natural. You're very quiet, Caleb observed. I'm thinking. About what? Eleanor considered how to answer. about how different this is from what I expected my wedding day to be. When I was young, I imagined something grand, a big church, fancy dress, all of Boston society watching. It seemed important then. And now? Now I'm grateful we did it simply, without spectacle or performance, just us and the people who matter. Caleb's hand found hers on the wagon seat, his fingers lacing through hers with careful pressure. I'm glad you're here, Eleanor. Whatever brought you to Wyoming, whatever you're running from, I'm glad the path led to my door. Eleanor squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, hands clasped, the setting sun painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The ranch looked different when they arrived, not changed physically, but transformed by Eleanor's new perspective. This was home now, not a temporary refuge or way station, but the place where she would build her life, for better or worse. James and Thomas had already started evening chores, their voices carrying from the barn as they tended horses and prepared feed. Caleb helped Eleanor down from the wagon with the same careful attention he'd shown all day, his hands steady at her waist. I should help them finish up, he said. Will you be all right alone for a bit? I'll start supper. Caleb nodded, but he didn't immediately leave. He stood there in the fading light, looking at her with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Finally, he spoke. About tonight. I meant what I said before. Nothing has to change just because we're legally married. I can still sleep in the loft, give you space and time to adjust. Eleanor understood what he was offering, the same patience and restraint he'd shown from the beginning, the same respect for her autonomy. And she loved him for it, she realized with sudden clarity. Not the passionate, all-consuming love of romance novels, but something deeper and more solid. The love built on trust and kindness and the absolute certainty that he would never hurt her. What do you want, Caleb? He seemed surprised by the question. What I want doesn't matter. This is about what you're comfortable with. That's not an answer. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. I'm asking what you want, not what you think you should want, or what's proper or what's expected. What do you actually want? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with the honesty she'd demanded. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I want you to feel safe with me. I want you to trust me enough that you don't flinch when I touch you. I want to wake up knowing you chose to be here, not that you felt trapped into staying. I do feel safe with you, Eleanor said softly. You've given me no reason to feel otherwise, and I'm choosing to be here. I chose it when I signed that certificate. I choose it now. Eleanor, I'm not saying I'm ready for everything, she interrupted, needing him to understand. My body is still healing, and my heart needs time too. But I don't want you sleeping in the loft like a stranger. We're married. We should at least share the same room. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Hope, perhaps, mixed with relief and continued wariness. You're certain? I'm certain I want to try. Eleanor touched his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. I'm certain I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in a very long time. The rest we can figure out as we go. Caleb covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his heart. Then we'll try. Slow and careful, at whatever pace you set. Thank you. He bent and kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender it made Eleanor's eyes sting. Then he released her and headed toward the barn, leaving her standing in the gathering dusk with her hand still warm from his touch. Eleanor went inside and lit the lamps, then set about making supper with the supplies they'd brought from town. Her ribs ached from the long day, but it was a manageable pain now, nothing like the sharp agony of those first weeks. She was healing. Slowly but surely, her body was recovering from Richard's violence. Her heart would take longer. She was stirring beans on the stove when the men came in for supper, dusty and tired, but in good spirits. Thomas was regaling them with a story about a horse that had tried to kick him, complete with dramatic reenactments that made even Caleb laugh. They ate with the easy camaraderie Eleanor was beginning to recognize as normal for this household. The Garrett brothers teased Caleb about being a married man now, about Eleanor having to civilize him, about how the house was already cleaner than it had been in years. Caleb bore it with patient good humor, occasionally shooting Eleanor looks that suggested he was simultaneously amused and embarrassed. After supper, James pulled out a battered fiddle Eleanor hadn't known he possessed. "Can't have a wedding without music," he declared, "even if we're a few hours late." He played surprisingly well, coaxing cheerful melodies from the worn instrument, while Thomas sang along in a pleasant baritone. Eleanor found herself laughing at their antics, at the ridiculousness and joy of this impromptu celebration in a frontier ranch house. Caleb stood and offered her his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Turner?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "I should warn you, my dancing skills are rusty." "Mine were never good to begin with. We'll manage." He led her in a simple waltz around the main room, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers gently. They moved awkwardly at first, neither quite sure of the steps or each other, but gradually found a rhythm that worked. Eleanor became aware of the solid warmth of him, the careful way he guided her through the turns, the restraint in his touch even as they danced. When the song ended, James immediately launched into another, faster this time. Thomas grabbed a wooden spoon and used it as a makeshift percussion instrument, and the ranch house filled with music and laughter and the kind of uncomplicated joy Eleanor hadn't experienced in years. They danced until Eleanor's ribs protested too much to continue, until James's fingers grew tired and Thomas ran out of songs to sing. When the music finally stopped, the Garrett brothers excused themselves to the barn with knowing grins, leaving Eleanor alone with her new husband in the lamplight. The silence felt suddenly heavy, weighted with possibility and uncertainty. Caleb cleared his throat. "I should bank the fire and check the doors. You go ahead and get ready for bed. I'll give you privacy." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness even as nerves fluttered in her stomach. She went to the bedroom and changed into her nightgown behind the privacy screen, then brushed out her hair with hands that trembled slightly. When she climbed into bed, she left space on the other side, a silent invitation and terror all at once. Caleb entered quietly a few minutes later, carrying a lamp. He'd already changed into sleeping clothes, simple cotton that made him look younger, less guarded. He set the lamp on the dresser and stood there uncertainly. "I can still sleep on top of the covers," he offered, "or in the chair if you'd prefer. The bed is big enough for both of us." Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Just stay on your side, please." "I will, I promise." Caleb extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness broken only by moonlight through the window. Eleanor heard him cross to the bed, felt the mattress dip as he settled on the far edge, keeping as much distance as possible between them. They lay there in the darkness, both clearly wide awake, neither speaking. Eleanor could hear his breathing, slow and controlled, could sense his awareness of her presence the same way she was hyper-aware of his. The intimacy of sharing a bed felt both terrifying and strangely comforting. "Eleanor?" Caleb's voice was quiet in the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you for today, for saying yes, for giving this a chance." Eleanor rolled onto her side, facing his direction, even though she couldn't see him clearly. "Thank you for making it possible, for offering safety without conditions, for being patient with me. You don't have to thank me for basic decency." "Maybe I do. Maybe we both need to remember that kindness isn't a given, that what we're building here is precious because it's chosen." She heard him shift, sensed him turning toward her. "Then I'm grateful we chose each other." "Me too." Silence settled again, but it was comfortable now, peaceful. Eleanor felt her body beginning to relax, the tension draining away as exhaustion caught up with her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, the daily work of building a marriage from the fragile foundation they'd established. But tonight, she was safe and warm and married to a good man who'd promised patience. That was enough. She drifted toward sleep, listening to Caleb's steady breathing, feeling more secure than she had in months. Just before unconsciousness claimed her, she felt him shift again, moving slightly closer without quite touching her. "Good night, Eleanor," he whispered. "Good night, Caleb." The next weeks passed in a blur of work and gradual adjustment. Eleanor threw herself into ranch life, with determination born of equal parts necessity and the need to prove herself. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spent her days cleaning, cooking, mending, tending the garden, and learning the 1,000 small tasks that kept a frontier household running. Her hands grew calloused, her skin tanned despite her bonnet, and the soft Boston lady she'd been slowly transformed into someone harder, more capable. The physical labor was good for her. It left no time for dwelling on the past, no energy for fear or regret. By the time she collapsed into bed each night, she was too exhausted for nightmares. And Caleb was always there, a solid presence on the other side of the mattress, keeping his promise to stay on his side while somehow still managing to make her feel protected. They developed routines, small rituals that marked their days. Morning coffee shared in companionable silence before the work began. Evening meals where Eleanor learned ranch business through listening to the men's discussions. Quiet hours after the Garrett brothers retired to the barn, when Eleanor would sew and Caleb would read aloud from books he'd accumulated over the years. Shakespeare, Mark Twain, accounts of Western exploration. Slowly, incrementally, Eleanor felt the walls around her heart beginning to crack. She noticed small things about Caleb that made her chest tighten with unexpected affection. The way he always saved her the last biscuit at breakfast. How he'd started bringing wildflowers from the fields when he rode in from checking the herd, placing them in a jar on the kitchen table without comment. The careful way he asked about her day, listening with genuine interest to details about the garden or her progress on a new quilt. And the restraint. Always the restraint, even as the distance between them in bed gradually shrank from opposite edges to a comfortable middle ground where they could talk quietly in the darkness before sleep. Even as casual touches became more frequent, his hand on her back as he passed behind her in the kitchen, her fingers brushing his when she handed him his coffee, small points of contact that felt both natural and charged with possibility. Sarah Mitchell made good on her promise, arriving one afternoon with her children and an invitation to the monthly women's gathering. Eleanor accepted gratefully, hungry for female companionship after weeks of primarily male conversation. The gathering was held at a ranch 15 miles east, in a house similar to Caleb's but larger, more established. The women who assembled there were a revelation. Rough-handed, plain-spoken, weathered by sun and hardship, they welcomed Eleanor with a directness that would have seemed rude in Boston, but felt refreshing here. They taught her how to preserve vegetables for winter, how to repair harnesses and clothing with neat, efficient stitches, how to navigate the social complexities of a small frontier community where everyone knew everyone else's business. And they warned her, in that blunt way frontier women had, about the challenges ahead. "Winter kills more marriages than adultery out here," an older woman named Martha Simmons said, her needle flashing as she worked on a quilt square. "Couples who seem solid in summer crack like ice when they're snowed in together for months." "The isolation gets to you," another woman added. "Some women go mad from it. Start talking to themselves, seeing things that aren't there. You need to prepare yourself mentally." Eleanor listened and absorbed, storing away their advice for future reference. But she found herself less worried about winter isolation than she might have been. After years of living in a crowded Boston townhouse where privacy was impossible and violence lurked behind every closed door, the idea of being snowed in with only Caleb for company seemed almost peaceful. On her way home from the gathering, riding beside Sarah in the wagon, Eleanor asked the question that had been nagging at her. What happened to Martha, Caleb's first wife? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands steady on the reins. She died of fever 4 winters back, but the fever was just what finished her. The territory had been killing her slowly for years. What do you mean? Martha came from St. Louis, city girl, refined, used to society and culture and all those things we don't have out here. She tried to make it work, and Caleb did everything he could to make her comfortable, but she was never happy, never adapted. The loneliness ate at her until there was nothing left for the fever to take. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Did she love him? I think so. In her way. But love isn't always enough when you're fundamentally unsuited to the life you're living. Sarah glanced at Eleanor. You're different, though. You're tougher. And you're running toward something rather than away from everything. How can you tell? Because you don't complain. Because you throw yourself into the work instead of resenting it. Because when you look at Caleb, I see gratitude in your eyes, not regret. Sarah's expression softened. Whatever you left behind in Boston, it must have been bad. You've got the look of someone who's survived something terrible. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her ribs, which no longer ached but still carried the memory of violence and faded yellow bruises. I survived. That's all that matters. It's not all that matters, but it's a start. Sarah pulled the wagon to a stop at the boundary of Turner land. You're going to be all right, Eleanor Turner. You've got backbone, and you've got a good man. That's more than most of us start with. When Eleanor returned to the ranch, she found Caleb waiting on the porch, his relief visible when he saw the wagon approaching. He helped her down with the same careful attention he always showed, but his hands lingered at her waist. "How was it?" he asked. "Enlightening, frightening, helpful." Eleanor smiled up at him. "The women here are nothing like Boston society ladies." "Is that good or bad?" "Definitely good. They're honest, direct. They don't waste time on pretense or performance." Caleb returned her smile. "You're fitting in here better than I expected, better than Martha ever did." The comparison hung in the air between them. Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying, that he'd been worried, that her adaptation to ranch life surprised and relieved him, that he was beginning to believe this arrangement might actually work. "I'm not Martha," Eleanor said quietly. "No, you're not." Caleb's hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture becoming familiar now. "You're stronger than she was, braver, more resilient. I'm also more damaged. We're all damaged. The question is whether we let it define us or drive us to build something better." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "You're building something better, Eleanor. I can see it happening." Eleanor leaned into his touch, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability and connection. "So are you." They stood there on the porch as the sun set, close enough to kiss but not quite crossing that threshold. The space between restraint and surrender, patience and passion, had become familiar territory for them both. Eventually, they would bridge that gap. But not tonight. Tonight was enough just to stand together in the gathering dusk, married and healing and hopeful. Inside, Eleanor could hear the Garrett brothers arguing good-naturedly about something, their voices carrying through the open windows. The ranch dog barked at something in the distance. Chickens settled in their coop with quiet clucking. The ordinary sounds of home and life and the future Eleanor was carefully, deliberately building. She was safe here, wanted here, healing here, and maybe, just maybe, learning to love here too. The first real test came on a Wednesday in late August, when the heat shimmered across the prairie in waves that turned the distant mountains into liquid mirages. Eleanor was in the garden, fighting weeds that seemed determined to choke the life from her carefully tended vegetables, when she heard horses approaching fast. Too fast. The kind of urgent pace that meant trouble. She straightened, one hand shading her eyes, the other instinctively pressing against ribs that no longer ached but remembered pain nonetheless. 3 riders were coming hard from the east, dust billowing behind them. As they drew closer, Eleanor recognized the lead horse, Caleb's big sorrel, pushed to a gallop that spoke of emergency. James burst from the barn, Thomas close behind, both moving with the sudden alertness of men accustomed to crisis. Eleanor dropped her weeding fork and hurried toward the house, her heart hammering against her breastbone. Caleb pulled up in a spray of dirt and gravel, already dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. His face was grim, his shirt dark with sweat, and something else that made Eleanor's stomach clench. Blood. Not his own, judging by the way he moved, but blood nonetheless. "What happened?" James demanded. "Fence cutters hit the Mitchell place, 3 men, maybe 4. Ran off half their herd and beat John Mitchell when he tried to stop them." Caleb's voice was tight with controlled fury. "He's alive, but barely. Sarah sent their boy to get me, and I rode to town for the marshal. He's gathering men now." Eleanor felt ice spreading through her veins despite the afternoon heat. "Is Sarah all right? The children?" Caleb's eyes found hers, and she saw the anger there, the protective rage that came from seeing violence done to people he cared about. "They're shaken but unharmed. The men didn't go near the house, just wanted the cattle. But John tried to stop them, and they made an example of him." Thomas swore viciously. "Those bastards have been working their way north for weeks. Marshall's been useless stopping them. He's trying to organize a posse now. I volunteered us." Caleb looked at James and Thomas, his expression hard. "Could be dangerous. Could be gone a few days tracking them. You're both free to say no." "Like hell," James said flatly. "Those are our neighbors, our community. We don't let scum like that operate without consequences." Thomas nodded his agreement, already moving toward the barn. I'll get the rifles ready and pack supplies. Eleanor watched this exchange with growing dread, understanding what it meant. Caleb was going hunting, not for game, but for men who'd proven themselves violent and ruthless, men who might kill rather than be captured. And he was taking the Garrett brothers with him, leaving her alone on the ranch with nothing but her fear and a dog for company. Caleb turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Eleanor, I need you to listen carefully. While we're gone, you keep the rifle loaded and by the door. Don't open up for anyone you don't know. And if you see riders approaching that you don't recognize, you get inside, bar the door, and fire a warning shot out the window. How long will you be gone? I don't know. Could be 2 days, could be a week. Depends on the trail and how far they've run. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I know this is frightening. I know being left alone here isn't what you signed up for. But I have to do this. John Mitchell helped me build this ranch when I had nothing. I owe him. Eleanor understood obligation and loyalty. She also understood violence and the men who dealt in it. What if they come here while you're gone? They won't. They're running north, away from the law. No reason to double back. But his eyes told a different story. That he couldn't guarantee her safety. That leaving her alone gnawed at him. That this was one of those impossible choices where every option carried risk. I'll be fine, Eleanor said, surprised to find she meant it. I can handle a rifle, and I'm not helpless. Go do what needs doing. Something flickered in Caleb's expression. Gratitude, pride, worry, all tangled together. He reached out and pulled her close, right there in the yard with James and Thomas watching, and held her tight enough that Eleanor felt his heart racing against her cheek. I'll come back, he promised into her hair. I swear to you, I'll come back. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his waist, ignoring the pain in her still healing ribs, and held on just as tightly. You better. I didn't marry you just to be widowed, a month later. Caleb's chest rumbled with something between a laugh and a sob. He pulled back enough to look at her face, then kissed her hard and desperate, nothing like the gentle touches they'd shared before. This was fear and need, and all the unspoken feelings they'd been carefully navigating around for weeks. When he released her, Eleanor stumbled slightly, her lips burning and her heart in her throat. Caleb steadied her, his hands gripping her shoulders. If anything happens, he said urgently, if anyone threatens you, you do whatever you need to do to survive. You understand me? Don't hesitate. Don't second-guess yourself. You survive. The intensity in his voice, in his eyes, shook her. I will. I promise. The Garrett brothers emerged from the barn leading saddled horses, rifles secured in scabbards, saddlebags packed with jerky and hardtack. They looked grim and determined, suddenly older than their years. Thomas paused to squeeze Eleanor's shoulder. You'll be all right, Mrs. Turner. Ranch dog's a good alarm, and you're tougher than you look. Thank you, Thomas. James nodded his own goodbye, then swung into his saddle. Caleb mounted his sorrel, the horse dancing sideways, sensing the tension in its rider. He looked down at Eleanor, his weathered face etched with worry and resolve. Lock the doors, load the rifle. Don't take chances. I won't. Go safely. Come home safely. He nodded once, then wheeled his horse and rode out, James and Thomas flanking him. Eleanor stood watching until they disappeared into the shimmering heat haze, 3 riders heading toward violence and uncertain outcome. Then she was alone. The silence pressed in immediately, heavy and oppressive despite the afternoon heat. Eleanor had been alone plenty of times since arriving at the ranch. Caleb and the brothers worked long hours in distant pastures. But this felt different. This was deliberate isolation with the knowledge that help wouldn't be coming if something went wrong. She forced herself into motion, channeling fear into productivity. First, she checked every door and window, testing locks and latches. Then she brought the rifle inside and loaded it carefully, the way Caleb had taught her during target practice sessions she'd thought were merely recreational. She placed it by the front door where she could reach it quickly. The ranch dog, a big mongrel named Bear, watched her preparations with intelligent brown eyes. Eleanor knelt and scratched behind his ears. It's just us now. You'll warn me if anyone comes, won't you? Bear licked her hand, and Eleanor chose to interpret this as agreement. Evening came slowly, the sun taking its time sinking toward the mountains. Eleanor made herself eat supper even though her stomach churned with anxiety. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, brought in water from the well. Normal chores performed in abnormal circumstances, each task a small victory against the fear threatening to overwhelm her. When darkness fell, she barred the doors and closed the shutters despite the stifling heat. She sat in the rocking chair with the rifle across her lap, listening to every sound the night produced. The creek babbling over rocks, crickets singing their endless song, an owl hooting from the cottonwoods, Bear's steady breathing from his spot by the door. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Nothing that suggested danger creeping closer through the darkness. But Eleanor couldn't shake the memories flooding back. Other nights, other fears, the sound of her brother-in-law's footsteps in the hallway outside her room, knowing violence was coming and being powerless to prevent it. She'd been trapped then, dependent on others for her survival, silenced by her own family's refusal to acknowledge the truth. She wasn't that woman anymore. She had a rifle. She had a locked door. She had the legal right to defend herself on her own property. And more importantly, she had the will to do it. The realization settled into her bones with quiet certainty. If those fence cutters came to this ranch, if anyone tried to harm her or take what belonged to her and Caleb, she would fight. She would survive. And she would make them regret underestimating her. The first night passed without incident. Eleanor dozed fitfully in the chair, jerking awake at every unfamiliar sound, her hand reaching for the rifle. Dawn came gray and cool, bringing relief and a new set of challenges. She had chores to manage, animals to tend, a ranch to maintain despite being alone. She fed the chickens and collected eggs, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for approaching riders. She milked the cow Caleb kept for household use, talking to the placid animal to hear a voice, even if it was just her own. She worked in the garden, pulling weeds while Bear lounged in the shade nearby, his presence reassuring. By afternoon, the isolation was beginning to wear on her, not from fear, but from the sheer strangeness of hearing nothing but her own thoughts for hours on end. She understood now what the women at the gathering had meant about winter madness. This was only day one, and already she felt the edges of her mind fraying slightly. She was considering reading aloud just to hear words spoken when Bear's head came up, his ears pricked forward. Eleanor's hand flew to the rifle she'd propped against the porch railing. She scanned the eastern trail and saw a single rider approaching at an easy pace. Too far yet to identify, but the measured speed suggested someone who belonged here rather than someone running from the law. Eleanor waited, tense and ready, as the rider drew closer. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Sarah Mitchell's sturdy mare. Sarah herself, in the saddle, looking tired but determined. Eleanor set down the rifle and hurried to meet her. "Sarah, how's John?" Sarah dismounted stiffly, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Alive, conscious. The doctor says he'll recover, though it'll take time. Those bastards broke his arm and 3 ribs, knocked out a tooth, gave him a concussion that had him seeing double for a day." Eleanor winced, her own ribs aching in sympathy. "I'm so sorry." "Not your fault, not anyone's fault except the men who did it and the marshal who's been too slow organizing a response." Sarah's voice was bitter with anger, barely controlled. "I came to check on you. Figured you'd be alone with Caleb riding with the posse. Come inside, I'll make coffee." They settled at the kitchen table, and Eleanor poured coffee that was too strong from sitting on the stove too long. Sarah drank it anyway, her hands wrapped around the cup like she needed the warmth despite the heat. "John tried to fight them off," Sarah said quietly. "Stupid, brave man. 3 armed men against one with nothing but determination and righteousness. They beat him bloody and left him in the dirt like garbage." "You must have been terrified." "I was furious." Sarah's eyes flashed. "Still am. I wanted to grab my rifle and go after them myself, but I had the children to protect and John bleeding in the yard. So I did what women always do. I patched up the damage, swallowed my rage, and waited for the men to handle it." Eleanor heard the frustration in her voice, the helpless anger of being forced to watch violence happen without being able to prevent or avenge it. "The posse will find them. Maybe. Or maybe those bastards will disappear into the mountains and resurface somewhere else next month to do the same thing to another family." Sarah set down her cup with enough force to slosh coffee onto the table. "I'm tired of being afraid, Eleanor. Tired of watching over my shoulder, Tired of worrying every time John rides out to check the herd that he won't come back. Is that what it's like? Living here? Eleanor heard the question escape before she could stop it, the fear she'd been suppressing bleeding through. Sarah's expression softened. Sometimes. Not always. Most days are just hard work and small joys and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. But days like yesterday remind you how fragile it all is, how quickly violence can shatter the peace you've worked so hard to create. They sat in silence for a moment, two women who understood violence from different angles, but knew its weight nonetheless. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Caleb will come back. He's too stubborn to let some fence cutters kill him, and when he does, he'll expect to find you safe and whole, running his ranch like you were born to it. I barely know what I'm doing, Eleanor admitted. None of us did when we started. We learned because we had to, because survival demanded it. Sarah stood, draining the last of her coffee. I should get back to John and the children, but I wanted you to know you're not alone out here. If you need anything, you send word. We take care of each other in this territory because no one else will. Eleanor walked her to the door, grateful beyond words for the visit and the reminder that community existed even in isolation. Thank you, Sarah, for checking on me, for everything. Thank yourself for being brave enough to stay. Sarah mounted her horse, then looked down at Eleanor with something like approval. You're going to make it here. I wasn't sure at first, but I am now. You've got the spine for this life. She rode away, leaving Eleanor alone again, but somehow less lonely. The visit had been brief, but it had broken the terrible silence and reminded her that she was part of something larger than just herself and her fears. The second night was easier than the first. Eleanor slept in the bed Caleb had vacated, surrounded by the faint scent of him on the pillows, and found it comforting rather than frightening. She woke with the dawn and threw herself into work, cleaning the barn, mending harnesses, organizing the tack room with ruthless efficiency. By the third day, she'd fallen into a rhythm. Rise before dawn, tend animals, work the garden, clean and organize, read during the hottest part of afternoon, more chores as evening cooled. Simple supper. Check all locks and load the rifle. Sleep. The isolation stopped feeling oppressive and started feeling almost peaceful. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor was completely autonomous. No one told her what to do or how to do it. No one criticized her choices or demanded justification for her actions. She ran the ranch according to her own judgment, made decisions without consulting anyone, and discovered she was more capable than she'd ever imagined. The fourth day brought a storm, rolling in from the mountains with thunder that shook the ranch house and lightning that turned afternoon into flickering twilight. Eleanor brought the chickens into the barn for shelter, moved the cow to her stall, and then retreated to the house to watch nature's violence from behind shuttered windows. The storm reminded her of her brother-in-law's rages, sudden, overwhelming, destructive. But unlike Richard's violence, this had no malice in it. It was simply weather, powerful and indifferent, following patterns as old as the earth itself. When it passed, leaving the prairie washed clean and sparkling, Eleanor felt something inside her shift and settle. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the storm, not of being alone, not of the future she was building in this wild territory. The fear was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it no longer controlled her. She'd survived violence. She'd survived abandonment. She'd survived this too. The fifth day, Caleb came home. Eleanor was in the garden, her hands deep in rich soil as she transplanted seedlings, when Bear's joyful barking announced riders approaching. She looked up to see three familiar figures on the eastern trail, moving at the easy pace of men who'd accomplished their mission and were ready for rest. She stood slowly, her heart hammering, soil falling from her hands as she watched them approach. Caleb sat his horse with the same steady competence he brought to everything, but Eleanor could see the weariness in his posture, the weight of whatever he'd seen and done hanging on his shoulders. When he dismounted, she was there, walking into his arms without hesitation or reservation. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, and she felt him shaking slightly, with relief or exhaustion or both. "You're all right," he said, not quite a question. "I'm fine. The ranch is fine. Everything's fine." Eleanor pulled back enough to see his face, to catalog the new lines around his eyes, the bruise darkening his jaw. Did you find them? We found them. It's handled. His voice was flat, emotionless, and Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying, that justice had been delivered in whatever form the frontier required, that the fence cutters wouldn't be troubling anyone else. She didn't ask for details, didn't need to know whether they'd been brought to the marshal or dealt with more permanently. That was Caleb's burden to carry, not hers. James and Thomas headed to the barn with the horses, giving them privacy. Caleb cupped Eleanor's face in his hands, his calloused palms rough against her skin. I was worried about you every minute I was gone. Worried you'd be afraid, or that something would happen, or that you'd decide this life wasn't worth the danger. I was afraid, Eleanor admitted. The first night was terrible, but I managed. I kept the ranch running, kept myself safe, and discovered I'm stronger than I thought. You are. Caleb's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. You're the strongest person I know. I'm not. You are, he insisted. You survived things that would have broken most people, crossed a continent alone, adapted to a life completely foreign to everything you knew, and managed this ranch solo while I was off chasing criminals. You're remarkable, Eleanor. I hope you know that. Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes, overwhelmed by the fierce pride in his voice. I was just doing what needed doing. That's what strength is. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but showing up day after day and doing what needs doing even when you're terrified. He leaned his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the space between. I'm proud of you, and grateful to have you as my wife. Caleb, her voice broke on his name. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and nothing like the restrained touches they'd shared before. This was raw and honest and full of all the feelings they'd been carefully dancing around, need and desire. And the beginning of love that went beyond gratitude or convenience. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor saw her own wonder reflected in Caleb's eyes. I should clean up, he said roughly. I'm covered in trail dust and probably smell like a horse. I don't care. I do. You deserve better than a man who hasn't bathed in 5 days. But he didn't move, didn't release her, clearly torn between propriety and the pull drawing them together. Eleanor made the decision for both of them. She took his hand and led him toward the house, past the curious stares of the Garrett brothers in the barn. Through the door she locked behind them. Eleanor, what are you— I'm done waiting, she said firmly, done being patient and careful and holding back. You've been nothing but kind to me, nothing but respectful and gentle, and I love you for it, but I'm tired of sleeping on opposite sides of the bed like strangers. I'm tired of pretending this marriage is just a business arrangement. Caleb stared at her, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. Your ribs are healed, have been for weeks. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I'm not fragile anymore, Caleb. And I'm not afraid. Not of you. Not of this. Are you certain? His hands came up to frame her face, his touch achingly gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. Because once we cross this line, I won't be able to go back to careful distance. I'll want all of you, Eleanor, not just the parts you feel safe sharing. Then take all of me. Eleanor's voice was steady, certain. I'm offering freely. No fear, no obligation, just choice. Caleb's control finally shattered. He kissed her with desperate hunger, his hands sliding into her hair, pulling her close enough that she could feel his heart racing against hers. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, years of loneliness and fear burning away in the heat building between them. He broke away long enough to scoop her into his arms, cradling her carefully despite the passion darkening his eyes. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. He carried her to their bedroom, kicked the door closed behind them, and laid her on the bed with reverent care. What followed was tender and passionate, careful and wild, everything Eleanor had been too afraid to hope for, and more than she'd imagined possible. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Eleanor's head on Caleb's chest, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting them in gold, and Eleanor felt more at peace than she had in years. I love you, Caleb said quietly. I think I have since you stepped off that stagecoach looking terrified but determined. I just didn't want to scare you by saying it too soon." Eleanor tilted her head to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "I love you too. It took me longer to realize it, but it's been growing since that first night when you gave me your bed and asked for nothing in return. I'd give you everything if you asked." "I know. That's why I love you." Eleanor kissed his jaw, his throat, savoring the freedom to touch him without reservation. "You gave me safety when I needed it most. You gave me time to heal, space to find myself, patience while I learned to trust again. You gave me everything that matters." Caleb pulled her closer, his arms banding around her with careful strength. "Then we're even. Because you gave me hope that this ranch could be a home again, that I could be more than just a man going through motions, that love was still possible even after everything." They lay there as the afternoon faded into evening, talking quietly about the days they'd spent apart, the fears they'd each faced, the future stretching before them full of possibility and promise. When hunger finally drove them from the bed, they dressed slowly, stealing kisses between buttons and laces, reluctant to leave the sanctuary they'd created. In the kitchen, they found James and Thomas had already started supper, the table set and food warming on the stove. The brothers took one look at Eleanor and Caleb and grinned knowingly. "About time," Thomas said cheerfully. "We were starting to think you two would never figure it out." "Shut up and eat your supper," Caleb replied, but there was no heat in it. They ate together, the four of them, talking about the ranch work that had accumulated during the men's absence, making plans for the coming weeks. But beneath the ordinary conversation, Eleanor felt the extraordinary shift that had occurred. This wasn't just a household anymore. It was a family, built by choice, strengthened by shared hardship, bound by something deeper than blood. After the Garrett brothers retreated to the barn, Caleb and Eleanor cleaned up together in comfortable silence. When the last dish was dried and put away, Caleb took her hand. "Come with me. There's something I want to show you." He led her outside into the twilight, past the barn and garden, to a small rise that overlooked the creek and the valley beyond. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, and the prairie stretched endless in all directions. "When I first came here," Caleb said quietly, "this felt like exile. Like I was running away from a life that hadn't worked out the way I'd planned. But standing here now with you beside me, it feels like home. Like exactly where I'm supposed to be." Eleanor leaned against his side, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "I feel the same way. Boston was where I was born, but this is where I choose to be. Where I want to build a life." "With me?" "With you. For as long as you'll have me." Caleb turned her in his arms, his expression serious in the fading light. "Then I'll have you forever. Through hard winters and dry summers, through good years and bad, through everything this territory throws at us. I'll be here, beside you, loving you." Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him, sealing the promise with touch instead of words. When they finally pulled apart, the stars had emerged in full, turning the sky into a canopy of light that seemed to bless their union. They stood there together, husband and wife in truth now, watching the night settle over their land. And Eleanor understood finally what it meant to be home. Not a place, but a person. Not escape, but choice. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to love anyway. She had come to Wyoming broken and desperate, seeking nothing more than survival. And she had found healing, partnership, and a future worth fighting for. The bruises were gone. The fear was fading. And in its place, something new was growing, strong and steady and full of hope. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, the endless demands of ranch life. But tonight, Eleanor stood in her husband's arms beneath the Wyoming stars and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The seasons turned as they always did in Wyoming territory. Summer heat giving way to autumn's crisp mornings, and the first hints of winter riding down from the mountains on cold northern winds. Eleanor watched the prairie transform from gold to brown, saw the cottonwoods along the creek blaze briefly with yellow before dropping their leaves like offerings to the coming cold. She transformed too, in ways both visible and invisible. Her hands grew strong from constant work, her body lean and capable from the physical demands of ranch life. But the deeper changes showed in how she moved through the world. Head high, shoulders back, meeting challenges with calm competence rather than anxious fear. The woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach barely resembled the woman who now stood in the ranch yard each morning, surveying her domain with quiet satisfaction. The night terrors that had plagued her first weeks gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the future rather than nightmares of the past. When she woke now, it was to Caleb's warmth beside her, his steady breathing a reminder that she was safe, wanted, loved. Their marriage deepened through the small intimacies of shared life, morning coffee drunk in companionable silence, evenings reading aloud by lamplight, nights tangled together in the bed that had become their sanctuary. Caleb showed her the ranch's hidden corners, a meadow where wild horses sometimes grazed, a hot spring tucked into a canyon, a ridge where the view stretched for miles in every direction. Eleanor showed him parts of herself she'd kept hidden even from herself, her sharp wit, her stubborn determination, her capacity for joy she'd thought Richard had beaten out of her permanently. They fought sometimes, sharp disagreements about ranch management or household decisions, but they fought fair and always made up before sleep. Eleanor discovered that conflict didn't have to end in violence, that anger could be expressed and resolved without anyone getting hurt. It was revolutionary, this understanding that marriage could include disagreement without destruction. October brought the first serious cold snap, frost painting the windows and ice forming on the water troughs. Eleanor woke one morning to find Caleb already dressed, staring out the window with an expression she'd learned to read as worry. "What is it?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "Snow's coming. I can smell it on the wind." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Big storm, from the feel of it. Maybe the first real winter storm of the season." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, looking out at the gray sky pressing down on the prairie. "How long do we have?" "Day? Maybe 2. We need to bring the herd closer to the ranch, stock up on firewood, make sure everything's secured." He pulled her against his side, his arm warm around her shoulders. "This is when ranch life gets hard, Eleanor. When you find out what you're really made of. Then I guess we'll find out together." Caleb kissed the top of her head, a gesture that had become habitual. "I'm not worried about you. You've proven yourself 10 times over already." They spent the day in furious preparation. Caleb and the Garrett brothers rode out to move the cattle to pastures closer to the ranch buildings, while Eleanor chopped and stacked firewood until her arms ached, brought in extra water, secured the chickens, and moved supplies from the barn to the house. The work was exhausting but satisfying. Each task completed a small victory against the approaching storm. By evening, the temperature had dropped sharply, and the wind carried the metallic smell of coming snow. They ate supper quickly, all 4 of them tense with anticipation, then secured the animals in the barn and retreated to the house. The snow started just after midnight. Eleanor woke to the sound of wind howling around the eaves, pressing against the shutters with force that made the whole house groan. Beside her, Caleb was already awake, his body tense with listening. "It's here," he said quietly. They rose and dressed, adding layers against the cold that was already seeping through the walls. In the main room, they found James and Thomas had come in from the barn, their faces serious as they listened to the storm's fury. "Horses are secure," James reported. "Cattle are huddled in the lee of the ridge. They'll be fine as long as it doesn't drift too deep." The storm lasted 3 days, dumping snow that piled against the buildings and transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world of white. They took turns fighting their way to the barn to tend animals, coming back frost-covered and shaking with cold. Eleanor kept the stove burning constantly, made endless pots of coffee and stew, and tried not to think about what would happen if the snow continued much longer. On the 3rd night, the wind finally died. Eleanor woke to silence so profound it seemed unnatural after days of constant howling. She slipped from bed carefully, trying not to wake Caleb, and went to the window. The world outside gleamed under a full moon, snow reflecting silver light until everything seemed to glow. It was beautiful and terrible, the kind of beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful. "Breathtaking, isn't it?" Caleb's voice came from behind her, his arms sliding around her waist. "And deadly." "That too. But we survived it. First real test of winter, and we came through fine." He rested his chin on top of her head. You did well, Eleanor. Kept everyone fed and warm, never complained, never panicked. Martha used to fall apart during storms like this. Eleanor heard the comparison and understood what he was really saying, that she'd proven herself in ways his first wife never had, that he was grateful for her strength. I was terrified the whole time. Being scared and being weak aren't the same thing. You're one of the bravest people I know. They stood together watching the moonlit snow until the cold drove them back to bed, where they warmed each other with touches that had become familiar and precious. The storm marked a turning point in how Eleanor saw herself. She'd survived Wyoming winter's first assault and emerged stronger. The confidence this gave her showed in everything she did, from how she dealt with difficult neighbors to how she managed the household during the long months when travel became nearly impossible. But the winter also brought unexpected challenges. In late November, Sarah Mitchell appeared at the ranch on a bitter cold afternoon, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "I need Eleanor," she told Caleb without preamble. "Mary Henderson's baby is coming early, and the doctor can't get through the snow. Eleanor's the only woman I know with enough education to help with a difficult birth." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. She'd assisted at one birth back in Boston, helping a maid in her sister's household, but she was hardly qualified for this. "Sarah, I'm not a midwife. You're the closest thing we have right now. Mary's in trouble, and her baby's turned wrong. I need someone who can keep calm and follow instructions." Sarah's eyes were desperate. "Please, Eleanor, she could die without help." Eleanor looked at Caleb, saw his concern, but also his faith in her. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll manage here. Sarah needs you." The ride to the Henderson place was brutal, snow flying into their faces as the horses struggled through drifts. Eleanor's hands and feet went numb despite her gloves and boots, but she focused on the medical knowledge she'd acquired from reading and observation, trying to remember everything she'd learned about childbirth and its complications. Mary Henderson was in bad shape when they arrived, exhausted from hours of labor, pale with blood loss, barely conscious. Her husband hovered uselessly, wringing his hands and looking like he might faint. "Out!" Sarah ordered him. "You're no help here." Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and approached the bed, forcing down her fear. Mary's eyes focused on her with desperate hope. "Please," Mary whispered, "save my baby." Eleanor examined her with hands that shook slightly, found what Sarah had described. The baby positioned wrong, too big to pass easily, stuck in the birth canal. This was beyond her limited knowledge, but turning back wasn't an option. "Sarah, I need you to talk me through this. Tell me what to do." What followed were the longest hours of Eleanor's life. Following Sarah's terse instructions, she worked to turn the baby, to guide it into the correct position, to help Mary through contractions that seemed endless. Her hands became slippery with blood, her arms ached from the strain, and fear clawed at her throat with every minute that passed without progress. But she didn't give up, didn't panic, kept working with steady determination even when it seemed hopeless. Finally, just before dawn, the baby crowned. Eleanor guided the tiny head, then the shoulders, and suddenly she was holding a red-faced, squalling infant, a girl, healthy despite her dramatic entrance into the world. "She's perfect," Eleanor breathed, tears streaming down her face as she placed the baby on Mary's chest. Mary sobbed with relief, clutching her daughter with trembling hands. Sarah cleaned up efficiently, her own eyes suspiciously bright. When everything was settled and both mother and baby were resting comfortably, Sarah pulled Eleanor aside. "You saved them both, you know that, right? Without you, Mary would have died trying to birth that baby. Probably the baby, too." Eleanor stared at her blood-stained hands, still shaking with adrenaline and residual fear. "I just did what you told me to do." "You did more than that. You stayed calm when most women would have panicked. You trusted yourself enough to try even when you were terrified." Sarah gripped her shoulders. "This territory needs women like you, Eleanor. Strong women who don't fall apart when things get hard." The words settled into Eleanor's chest, warm and affirming. She'd spent so many years being told she was weak, dramatic, too sensitive. Richard had convinced her she was useless, and her sister had reinforced that message through silent complicity. But here in Wyoming, faced with real challenges that tested her actual capabilities, Eleanor was discovering she'd been lied to about who she was. She wasn't weak. She was strong enough to cross a continent alone, to adapt to a completely foreign life, to save a woman and baby from dying in childbirth. The bruises Richard had left on her body had healed. Now, finally, the damage he'd done to her sense of self was healing too. When Eleanor finally made it back to the ranch 2 days later, delayed by fresh snow and the need to ensure Mary's recovery, Caleb met her at the door with an expression that made her breath catch. Pride and relief and love all mixed together in his gray eyes. "Sarah sent word about what you did," he said, pulling her inside and into his arms. "The whole territory is talking about how Eleanor Turner saved Mary Henderson and her baby." "I was terrified the whole time." "But you did it anyway. That's what courage is." He kissed her cold forehead, her frozen cheeks, her numb lips. "I'm so proud of you I could burst." Eleanor laughed, the sound bubbling up from someplace deep and genuine. "Don't burst, I just got home." Winter deepened, and with it came the isolation the women had warned Eleanor about. Days when the snow was too deep for visiting, when the world shrank to just the ranch buildings and the people sheltered within them. But Eleanor found she didn't mind the isolation the way she'd feared. The ranch house felt cozy rather than confining, filled with lamplight and conversation and the comfortable rhythms of people who knew each other well. She and Caleb spent long evenings talking about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. He told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera, about the loneliness that had driven him west seeking something he couldn't name. Eleanor talked about Boston, about her parents' death and her sister's betrayal, about the violence she'd endured and the strength she'd found in escaping it. "Do you miss it sometimes?" Caleb asked one night as they lay together in the darkness. "The culture, the refinement, everything Boston offered?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss my parents, the people they were before they died, the life we had when they were alive. But the Boston I left behind? No. I don't miss the hypocrisy, the way everyone looked the other way while terrible things happened. I don't miss feeling powerless and trapped." "And you don't feel trapped here?" "I feel free here. Even when the snow is too deep to leave the ranch, even when I'm working so hard my body aches, I feel free. Because I'm choosing this life. It's mine in a way nothing in Boston ever was." Caleb pulled her closer, his hand splaying possessively across her stomach. "I'm glad. Because I can't imagine this life without you anymore. You've become essential to everything." Eleanor kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the feelings she sometimes still struggled to voice. Love and gratitude and the bone-deep certainty that she'd found her place in the world. Christmas came, celebrated simply with a roasted goose and gifts they'd made for each other. Caleb carved Eleanor a beautiful wooden box for her sewing supplies. Every joint fitted perfectly, the lid inlaid with darker wood in a pattern that reminded her of the prairie in summer. Eleanor knitted Caleb a scarf from wool she'd carded and spun herself, soft and warm in shades of gray that matched his eyes. The Garrett brothers received hand-knitted socks and looked embarrassingly pleased, mumbling their thanks while their ears turned red. It was nothing like the elaborate Christmas celebrations Eleanor remembered from Boston, but it felt more genuine, more meaningful. Spring arrived slowly, snow melting in increments, revealing the brown prairie beneath. With the thaw came news from town. Rebecca Price had left her husband and returned east, unable to endure another Wyoming winter. Several other families had given up and sold their claims, heading back to gentler climates. But the Turners remained, as did the Mitchells and the Hendersons and all the other stubborn souls who decided this harsh territory was worth the hardship. Eleanor celebrated her first anniversary in Wyoming by planting an expanded garden, her hands confident in the soil, her body strong from a year of constant work. When Caleb found her there, dirt under her fingernails and satisfaction on her face, he knelt beside her and took her hand. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression serious. Eleanor's heart stuttered with sudden fear. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. That's what I need to tell you." He pressed her palm against his chest over his heart. "When you first arrived, I thought I was offering you safety and you were offering me practical help around the ranch. A fair exchange, nothing more. But Eleanor, you've given me so much more than that. You've given me a reason to care about the future again. You've made this house a home. You've shown me what real partnership looks like." Caleb, let me finish. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, calloused skin on calloused skin. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I wanted you to know that, officially. Not just in the heat of passion or casual endearment, but as a deliberate statement of fact. I love you, Eleanor Turner, and I'm grateful every single day that you stepped off that stagecoach and into my life. Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks, her throat too tight for words. She threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. This good man who'd given her everything that mattered: safety, respect, patience, and love. I love you too, she managed finally. More than I can say. You saved my life, Caleb, not just by offering me a place to run to, but by showing me I was worth saving, that I was strong and capable and deserving of kindness. They held each other in the garden she'd planted, surrounded by new growth and the promise of harvest, and Eleanor felt the last pieces of her broken heart finally knit together whole. Summer came again, bringing long days and hard work and evening thunderstorms that turned the prairie electric with possibility. Eleanor worked beside Caleb in the fields, rode out to check cattle with James and Thomas, attended Sarah Mitchell's monthly gatherings where she'd become something of a hero after saving Mary Henderson. In late July, she began to suspect she might be pregnant. The nausea that gripped her mornings, the exhaustion that hit her afternoons, the way her body felt different in subtle ways she couldn't quite name. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope, afraid to jinx it by speaking the possibility aloud. But when she missed her second monthly courses, she knew. She was carrying Caleb's child, creating new life from the love they'd built together. She told him one evening after supper when they were alone on the porch watching the sunset. I think I'm pregnant, she said simply. Caleb went absolutely still. Then he turned to her, his eyes wide with wonder and fear and joy all mixed together. You're certain? As certain as I can be without a doctor confirming it. But yes, I'm certain. We're going to have a baby, Caleb. He pulled her into his arms so carefully, like she might shatter, and Eleanor felt him trembling against her. A baby, he whispered. Eleanor, we're going to have a baby. They held each other as the sky burned gold and red and purple, holding this new possibility between them like the precious thing it was. Eleanor thought about everything she'd survived to reach this moment. The violence, the fear, the desperate flight across a continent. All of it had led here, to a Wyoming ranch, where she'd found safety and love and the courage to build a future. The pregnancy progressed well despite the hard work Eleanor refused to give up. Caleb fretted constantly, trying to prevent her from lifting anything or working too hard. But Eleanor was stubborn. I'm pregnant, not dying, she told him firmly. Women have been working through pregnancy since the beginning of time. I'm not going to spend 9 months sitting idle. But she did make concessions, accepting help more readily, resting when exhaustion hit, letting Caleb pamper her in small ways that made her feel cherished. The baby was born on a cold February morning during a brief break between winter storms. Sarah Mitchell and Mary Henderson attended the birth, returning the favor Eleanor had done them. The labor was hard, but mercifully shorter than Mary's had been. And when Eleanor finally held her daughter, perfect and pink and wailing with healthy lungs, she understood with sudden clarity that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of new growth. Not forgetting the past, but refusing to let it define the future. Caleb cried when he held his daughter for the first time, tears streaming down his weathered face as he stared at the tiny person they'd created together. She's perfect, he breathed. What should we name her? Eleanor had thought about this for months. Hope, she said. Her name is Hope. Because that's what this child represented. Hope for the future. Hope for healing. Hope that love could triumph over violence and fear. Hope that the courage to choose, to change, to begin again, could lead to something beautiful. The years that followed brought more children, 2 sons who inherited their father's gray eyes and steady temperament. The ranch prospered, expanding to include more land and cattle. The Garrett brothers eventually married and started their own homesteads nearby, remaining close friends and occasional ranch hands. Eleanor became a pillar of the community, known for her strength and her willingness to help neighbors in crisis. She delivered babies, nursed the sick, organized the women's gatherings when Sarah Mitchell grew too old to manage them. She taught her children to read and write, passing on the education her parents had given her. And through it all, Caleb remained her anchor, steady, patient, loving. They grew old together on that Wyoming ranch, watching their children grow and the territory transform from wild frontier to settled state. The difficulties didn't disappear. There were still hard winters and dry summers, still losses and setbacks and challenges. But they faced everything together, partnerships strengthened by years of shared hardship and joy. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Eleanor stood on the same rise where Caleb had first told her this felt like home. Her hair had silver threads now, and her hands bore the marks of decades of hard work. But she stood straight and strong, surveying the ranch they'd built together with satisfaction and pride. Caleb came up behind her, his movement slower now but still sure, and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor leaned back against him, fitting perfectly into his embrace after all these years. "I'm thinking about the woman who stepped off that stagecoach 25 years ago. How scared she was, how broken, how certain she'd never feel safe again. And I wish I could go back and tell her it would all work out, that the bruises would heal, the fear would fade, and she'd find more happiness than she ever imagined possible." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd given her everything that mattered. "Thank you, Caleb, for seeing past the fear to the strength underneath, for giving me time to heal, for loving me. Thank you for choosing me, for choosing this life, for building something beautiful out of what started as desperate necessity." He kissed her forehead, a gesture as familiar and precious now as it had been on their wedding day. "I love you, Eleanor Turner, today, tomorrow, and every day after." Eleanor kissed him back, pouring into it all the love and gratitude and joy that filled her heart to overflowing. Behind them, she could hear their children and grandchildren gathering for the anniversary celebration, laughter and voices, the sounds of family and life and love. She had come to Wyoming broken, seeking nothing more than escape from violence. She had found healing, partnership, and a future beyond anything she'd dared to dream. The bruises Richard had left were long gone, replaced by laugh lines and sun wrinkles and the honorable scars of a life fully lived. And standing there in her husband's arms, surrounded by the family they'd built together, Eleanor understood the profound truth of her journey. She hadn't merely escaped violence. She'd found home. She'd found herself. She'd found the courage to transform fear into hope, and hope into love that would endure for generations. The prairie stretched endless around them, beautiful and harsh and full of possibility. And Eleanor Turner, who had once been Eleanor Wright, afraid and alone and desperate for safety, stood on the land she'd claimed as her own, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She was home. Finally, completely, irrevocably home.